We live in a time where silence has become almost unbearable. The moment things go quiet, we instinctively reach for a phone, a song, a screen, anything to fill the void. And it's not just habit, it's fear disguised as distraction. Blaise Pascal once said, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." That quote hits harder today than ever. In a world engineered to keep us stimulated, silence forces a confrontation with something we've become masters at avoiding: ourselves. When there's no noise, no feed to scroll, no voice narrating our thoughts for us, we're left with the raw presence of our own being. And for many, that feels like staring into a mirror they never asked for. So we drown it out. We make noise to avoid depth. But what if silence isn't absence, but presence? What if its emptiness is only apparent, and what it really offers is a gateway inward, a doorway to clarity? In silence, time slows down in ways the modern mind finds disorienting. We're so used to motion and stimulation that stillness can feel like a malfunction. But silence doesn't malfunction. It reveals. It reveals how much of our inner world has been drowned by the external one. Think about how quickly discomfort arises when there's no music in the background, no buzz of a notification, no ongoing chatter. That discomfort isn't about the world outside. It's about the neglected world within. Silence strips away the superficial, the constant commentary, the masks we wear to keep ourselves from feeling too much. It demands that we face the truth of who we are when there's no audience, no feedback, no performance. And that's precisely why it's terrifying. In silence, we are unshielded. But in that vulnerability lies the possibility of something radical: authenticity. Noise has become the default setting of modern life. Not just literal noise, but mental, emotional, digital. It's a kind of psychological smog, clouding our ability to see ourselves and others clearly. We scroll instead of think. We react instead of reflect. And this constant engagement gives the illusion of connection, when in reality, it often deepens our sense of disconnection. From ourselves, from each other, from meaning. Silence interrupts this loop. It's an act of refusal. A quiet, gentle rebellion against a system that profits from our constant attention and anxiety. To be silent is to reclaim space. Space to think deeply, to feel fully, to hear what is usually drowned out. And what we often hear, once the noise dies down, isn't peace at first. It's the echoes of things we've long suppressed. But listening to them is where healing begins. More than ever, silence has become countercultural. It is no longer just the absence of sound. It is the presence of will. It's choosing to pause when everything around you demands acceleration. It's choosing not to comment, not to react, not to be visible in a culture that equates visibility with worth. Silence becomes a way of being that challenges the default pace of society. It is no longer passive. It is active. It holds a power that noise can't replicate. A depth, a dignity, a stillness that refuses to be consumed or commodified. And perhaps, most importantly, silence becomes a sanctuary. Not because it protects us from the world, but because it prepares us to re-enter it more whole, more rooted, more awake. The quieter we become, the more we begin to hear. And what we hear is not empty. It's essential. In the Taoist worldview, silence is not a void. It is the origin. While the modern world treats silence as a pause between meaningful moments, Lao-Tzu saw it as the very ground from which meaning arises. The Tao, the way of nature, is not something to be captured by speech or dissected by reason. It reveals itself in stillness, in the gentle flow of what is unspoken. To be silent, in this tradition, is not to retreat or withdraw. It is to listen, but not with ears, with presence, with a mind quiet enough to perceive the subtleties of existence that noise always drowns. Lao-Tzu warned, Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. These words are not meant to shame expression, but to elevate another kind of understanding, the kind that does not need to be announced, but felt. Our world thrives on the opposite of this principle. We are trained to speak, to post, to project, to explain ourselves constantly. But in doing so, we often lose the chance to simply be. Silence, in Lao-Tzu's philosophy, is not emptiness, but alignment. It is the space where the self dissolves into the flow of the world, not to disappear, but to harmonize. True wisdom does not impose. It does not shout. It watches like a mountain and moves like a river. When we are silent, not just outwardly, but inwardly, we create room for the Tao to enter, not through effort, but through surrender, through the letting go of needing to be heard, to be affirmed, to be right. And in that letting go, something remarkable happens. Clarity arises without needing explanation. This clarity is not mental, but existential. In silence, we stop wrestling with life and start moving with it. The Tao becomes less of a mystery and more of a rhythm we feel when we stop trying to control everything. The modern obsession with articulation, with naming and categorizing, builds a wall between us and experience. Silence tears down that wall. It allows life to reach us unfiltered, without the layers of commentary and ego. In silence, we perceive not only the world more clearly, but ourselves. The mind quiets not because it is forced, but because it finally feels safe to rest. And from that rest, a deeper kind of knowing emerges. A knowing that doesn't need proof. A knowing that simply is. To embrace silence in the Taoist sense is not to abandon the world. It is to merge with its deeper current. Lao-Tzu's silence is not passive, but deeply alive. It contains the wisdom of mountains, the patience of seasons, the compassion of rivers that carve through stone without ever raising their voice. And this silence is accessible to all, not through status or education or speech, but through presence, through the radical act of not needing to add anything to the moment. Imagine what it means to live that way, to meet life not with argument, but with openness, to carry silence not as absence, but as a gift. In a world obsessed with saying more, the one who speaks less and listens more becomes the true revolutionary. For Søren Kierkegaard, silence was not merely a spiritual exercise or a poetic ideal. It was a necessary revolt against the noise of the crowd. In a time when the individual was already being swallowed by the collective voice of public opinion, Kierkegaard warned of a deepening danger, the loss of the self. He believed that truth could only be found in subjectivity, in the intimate, inward relationship between a person and their own existence. And silence was the atmosphere where that relationship could finally take root. In a noisy world, filled with posturing and performance, silence becomes the terrain of authenticity. Not because it's peaceful, but because it strips away illusion. In silence, you are no longer playing a role. You are simply and painfully yourself. But this is not a comforting kind of silence. Kierkegaard's silence is often laced with dread, with the anxiety of confronting what lies beneath our carefully curated identities. He speaks of despair as the sickness unto death, a condition where the self refuses to be itself or wishes to be something it is not. And the only way out of this despair, he suggests, is through inwardness, through turning away from the endless chatter of the world and listening to the deep, sometimes disturbing questions that arise in silence. Who am I really? What am I called to become? Silence becomes the crucible in which these questions are not just asked, but lived. And in living them, one suffers, but also begins, at last, to exist. In the Kierkegaardian sense, silence is not a withdrawal from life, but an entrance into its most profound dimensions. It is the refusal to be distracted by the crowd, to be defined by the gaze of others. It is the moment when the individual stands alone, not lonely, but singular, before the weight of freedom and the necessity of choice. To be silent is not to disengage, but to assume responsibility for one's own being. And this silence is not empty. It is filled with the tremors of becoming. It is the silence before a leap of faith, the moment when all external justifications collapse and the only thing left is a self-facing eternity. And this leap cannot be explained. It must be lived in silence. In a time when everyone has something to say, often loudly and instantly, Kierkegaard's silence is a kind of heresy. It is the decision not to perform for the algorithm, not to shout in order to be heard, not to exist only in reaction to others. It is a silence that resists the flattening of the soul by refusing to be available for consumption. This silence is not about peace. It's about depth. It's about becoming so inwardly alive that the surface no longer matters. In this way, Kierkegaard gives us a model for a kind of spiritual defiance, a way of reclaiming ourselves from the noise, not through escape, but through radical inwardness. In silence, we meet not only ourselves, but something greater, a God who speaks not in thunder, but in stillness. Thomas Merton did not see silence as withdrawal from the world, but as a doorway into its deeper truth. For him, silence was not emptiness, but listening, a sacred receptivity. In a world saturated with noise and opinion, Merton entered a monastery not to escape life, but to find it without filters. And what he discovered there was not the absence of the world, but its essence. In silence, the soul is no longer fragmented. It is recollected. It is made whole. He believed that words, when used carelessly, distract us from meaning. But silence, embraced consciously, reveals it. The word is not more sacred than the silence, he wrote. Because silence, unlike speech, does not impose. It waits. It does not seek to convince. It invites. And it is in that waiting, in that invitation, that we begin to hear what cannot be spoken. Merton's silence was not an escape from responsibility. It was a deeper engagement with reality. He saw that the noise of modern life, both external and internal, blinds us not only to others, but to the divine. We become trapped in what he called the tyranny of activity, always doing, achieving, responding, yet rarely being. Silence, then, becomes an act of resistance, not because it's passive, but because it disrupts the machinery of distraction. It opens a space in which the soul can breathe, where contemplation becomes possible. And in contemplation, Merton believed, we don't merely think, we see. We perceive the interconnectedness of all things, the beauty that hides beneath the surface of routine, the still point in the turning world. Silence is not the absence of participation. It is the beginning of understanding. To sit in silence, especially today, is to declare that you will not be owned by urgency, that you will not let the algorithms dictate your value or your attention. Merton's life was a testimony to this quiet defiance. In the cloistered rhythms of monastic life, he discovered that stillness could be revolutionary, not in the way of protest signs or speeches, but in the radical shift it initiates within. The revolution Merton speaks of is not out there. It is here, in the inner room where no one else can enter. And when that room is finally quiet, what we meet is not an idea, but presence. Silence, for Merton, is the place where God is no longer a theory but a living reality, subtle, tender, and unsettlingly close. It is where the soul learns to hear again, not with ears, but with its very being. In a world obsessed with articulation, Merton teaches us to honor what cannot be said. His silence was not sterile, but luminous. It contained multitudes. It held sorrow and joy, doubt and devotion. And more than anything, it held space for mystery, for reverence, for transformation. To follow Merton's path is not to become silent in a superficial way, but to cultivate a silence that listens, that surrenders, that allows. A silence that is not the absence of voice, but the fullness of presence. It is a silence that protests the noise not by opposing it, but by transcending it. And in that transcendence, we do not abandon the world. We return to it more awake, more compassionate, more real. Because the silence that Merton speaks of is not a retreat. It is a return to the heart of all things. In an age where everything seems to demand a reaction, where our thoughts, opinions, and voices are pushed to the forefront at every moment, silence can no longer be viewed merely as passive. It becomes a radical act of defiance. Choosing silence in a world that values noise above all else is a rejection of the system that profits from our attention, our outrage, and our constant engagement. This form of silence is not a withdrawal from the world, but a refusal to participate in its trivialities. It is, in essence, a contemplative civil disobedience. It is an active protest, not through words, but through stillness. When the world demands that we react, shout, and contribute to the endless cycle of opinion, silence becomes an assertion of self, an insistence on not being swept up in the frenzy of superficial engagement. This silence is not empty. It is filled with purpose. It is a deliberate act of choosing to listen instead of speak, to reflect instead of react, to observe instead of perform. In choosing silence, we refuse to be complicit in the noise that creates division, that escalates conflict, and that perpetuates the cycle of endless stimulation. This form of disobedience is subtle, but it is profoundly transformative. It says, "I will not give in to the pressure to perform for you. I will not contribute to the illusion that louder is better, that more opinions make for a better world." It challenges the notion that visibility and volume are the ultimate measures of worth. Silence, in this sense, is a way of saying, "I will not allow myself to be reduced to a soundbite. I will not be manipulated by the need for constant validation." Choosing silence is also a way of resisting the constant pace of life that demands our immediate responses. In today's world, time has become a commodity to be used, consumed, and optimized. The constant pressure to stay connected, to be constantly on, leaves little room for reflection, for depth, or for contemplation. In choosing silence, we step outside the rush. We reclaim time not as a tool to be spent, but as a space to be experienced. Silence allows us to reclaim our own rhythm, not dictated by the external world, but by the internal world. It is a way of saying, "I will not be governed by the clock. I will not allow the world's demands to determine my pace." Moreover, silence in this context is not about apathy or indifference to the suffering of the world. On the contrary, it is a deeper engagement. By resisting the noise and chaos of modern life, we create space within ourselves to truly hear, to listen not just to others, but to the world itself, to its suffering and beauty, to its contradictions and its truths. Silence allows us to approach the world not as a spectator, but as a participant in a way that is authentic, grounded, and connected. It is a form of civil disobedience because it refuses to be swept up in the narratives imposed by society. It allows us to hear more clearly what is really happening, what really matters, and what we are really being asked to do. And in that clarity, action becomes more powerful, more intentional, and more meaningful. In a time of endless noise and distractions, choosing silence is the ultimate revolutionary act. It is a way of rejecting the artificial urgency of modern life and returning to something deeper, something truer. Silence is not an absence. It is a presence. It is the presence of clarity, of intention, of awareness. It is the space where the self can breathe, where the soul can grow, where the world can be seen in its truest form. Choosing silence in a noisy world is not just an act of resistance. It is an act of creation. It is the creation of a space where the soul can awaken, where truth can emerge, and where the individual can finally stand free from the tyranny of the collective din.